Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
When Theresa May announced an extra £20 billion a year for the NHS this morning, she explained it would be paid for partly by a Brexit dividend, money saved when the UK no longer has to contribute funds to the EU. But that claim has raised widespread questions and has now not only been dismissed by Labour, but also by one of the Prime Minister's own MPs who called it tosh. We'll be analysing Mrs May's numbers ourselves in a moment. But first, this report from our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall.
Remember this? Well, today the Prime Minister has announced that she will honour a promise she herself never made and provide £20 billion to the NHS by the early 2020s. Coincidentally, just over £350 million a week, the so-called Brexit dividend.
Some people may remember seeing a figure on the side of a bus a while back of £350 million
a week, yeah.
In cash. Well, I can tell you that what I'm announcing will mean that in 2023-24, there will be about £600 million a week in cash, more in cash, going into the NHS. Now, of course, we've got to fund that money. That will be through the Brexit dividend, the fact that we're no longer sending vast amounts of money every year to the EU once we leave the EU.
This is language Brexiteers have wanted the PM to use for some time, to project a positive vision of a post-Brexit Britain. It's a phrase she has herself hitherto refused to use, and maybe there's a good reason for that. Opponents say that the dividend does not exist.
Nobody accepts that she's going to get this money from Brexit. I mean, that is such a gimmick. I mean, there's loads of economists who are saying that, you know, Brexit is going to cost the UK economy. So I think that's going to unravel pretty quickly. And actually, it says something about the weakness of Theresa May, that why can't she just be upfront with people and say, we're going to increase borrowing, the Tory government is going to increase borrowing.
This criticism doesn't just come from the opposition benches. Former GP and Tory chair of the Health Select Committee has tweeted this morning. The Brexit dividend tosh was expected, but treats the public as fools. Sad to see government slide to populist arguments rather than evidence on such an important issue. This will make it harder to have a rational debate about the who and how of funding and sharing this fairly. The who and how will have to be laid out in short order. The Brexit dividend isn't going to pay out very much. The government has already committed to spending all of the money that it might get back from Brussels right up to and including the 2020s. So the money has to be raised somehow, and it's going to be raised by the man, the Chancellor, who lives in that building behind me. You can only do that either by increasing borrowing, cutting spending in other departments, or increasing your taxes. And £20 billion isn't chicken feed. It will be the equivalent of 1% on your national insurance, 1% on your income tax, and more besides. And even that might not be sufficient, with NHS providers warning that at only 3.4% a year, it's not enough even to keep up with rising costs.
We would regard this extra money as welcome and a significant improvement on what we've seen over the last 10 years. But given where we're at as a result of that austerity period and the challenge going forward, I think we are going to have to make some hard choices.
It's become a truism of modern politics that you can't predict the future. But remember this, politicians have no idea what tax revenues will be after Brexit. If the deal isn't good and growth slows, it could be much less than the Treasury projects today. Then, even 3.4% a year for the NHS might be but a dim and distant hope. Lewis Goodall, Sky News, Westminster.
So in her interview, Theresa May promised an extra £600 million a week for the NHS by 2023. But, as Lewis explained there, her figures have been heavily questioned today. So, do the numbers add up? Well, the government currently spends about £122 billion on the NHS. By 2024, it's going to be £20 billion more than now in real terms. Now, the money won't appear overnight. The NHS budget will rise gradually by around 3.4% each year for the next 5 years. So, how will it be funded? Well, after Brexit, the UK will no longer have to contribute funds to the EU, and last year that amounted to about £18 billion. And the government claims that that will help to foot the bill. But there's expected to be a big upfront cost of breaking away from the EU, and that's been estimated at around £37 billion. And the UK will most likely continue to pay into certain pan-European projects and fund subsidies, which could cost around £4 billion a year. And on top of that, the Institute for Fiscal Studies says that the economic hit from Brexit will leave Britain £15 billion worse off a year. And that would leave a £38 billion shortfall, which may need to be made up through taxes and borrowing. And that's before finding the extra money for the NHS, which could fall to taxes and borrowing too.
£20 billion is quite a lot of money for the NHS, and it's going to come from either higher taxes or higher borrowing. There is not something called a Brexit dividend to pay for it. In the short run, arithmetically, there isn't, because we're going to continue giving money to the EU and spending money on farmers and so on through to 2023. There's literally no money there. In the longer run, the government has accepted that the economy will be smaller and tax revenues will be lower as a result of Brexit, and so again there is no Brexit dividend.
Well, today's political argument has mainly been about where the money will come from, but despite the eye-watering figures, the question also remains whether it'll be enough to avert another NHS crisis. Fraser Maud got reaction from doctors and patients to the funding boost.
The government feels the announcement of extra funds for the NHS warrants a fanfare. Their opponents, though, say the Brexit dividend is a load of hot air. The NHS users at this concert in Leeds are hopeful that the government can deliver on their promises.
The government made a commitment, and hopefully it'll happen, and it can only be a good thing.
It's not just coming from the Brexit fund, it's probably going to come from increased taxation, which is probably where it always needed to come from anyway.
I think the money will be found, but my fear is the only thing that it is to make sure that it is directed to the right places.
GPs are likely to benefit from the extra funds, as are other frontline services. A 3.4% rise is good, they say, but perhaps not quite good enough.
We need to work with NHS England to ensure that the money is spent wisely and appropriately. We don't want additional bureaucracy. We don't want money spent in privatisation of services. What we really want is front-end services supported so they can really step up and meet the needs of our patients.
Bed blocking, cancelled and delayed treatments and waiting times are all areas which patients would like to see benefit from a cash injection. Whether this extra funding allows the NHS to provide the world-leading healthcare which Theresa May says it will, or proves to be the inadequate sticking plaster referred to by her critics, one key issue will be where it's going to be spent. The Local Government Association has already bemoaned the fact that there isn't going to be an equal level of spending in social care. Patients and visitors here at the Leeds General Infirmary are not short of ideas as to where the funds are needed.
It needs to come down to the people who require it in there. You know, nurses, doctors, everybody on the front line. I've got a friend in there, without them she'd be dead.
Things like mental health and as well, you know, with dementia. I mean, I've got some experience of dementia in the family.
I think one of the problems that are most prevalent for me from my circle is the waiting times, specifically for GP appointments, midwife appointments.
How and where the money will be raised and spent will be made clearer in the coming weeks. Fraser Maud, Sky News, Leeds.
Well, let's return to our political correspondent Lewis Goodall, who's in Downing Street for us this evening. So, Lewis, to what extent has the shine been taken off the Prime Minister's NHS announcement with these questions over how it's going to be funded?
Well, it should have been a good news story, shouldn't it? More money for the NHS. No voter, no matter how they vote, would be against that, even if it isn't quite the 4% that the NHS say that they need. And yet it hasn't been. And why is that? Well, in one word, because of politics. Because no matter what the government does, no matter what the Prime Minister announces, it all seems to have to be brought back to Brexit. Why did the Prime Minister use that phrase, the Brexit dividend? A phrase she has not used before, but one that the Foreign Secretary has urged her to use on numerous occasions. Well, she felt the need to give a win to the Brexiteers, to give them a piece of rhetoric, a piece of policy that would enable them to say, look, we've done as we said that we would. But the problem is with that it's the classic Brexit whack-a-mole problem for Theresa May. As soon as she gets rid of one problem, another one pops up, because then she has Remainer MPs on her own side while saying, wait a minute, that's absolutely nonsense. The Brexit dividend does not exist. And as a result of doing that, she has found herself dragged in to the Brexit quicksand all over again, despite the fact that, as I say, that should be a good news story. She's going to try and propel that message out again tomorrow. She's going to be making a speech, essentially re-announcing all of the things that she has announced today. But for anyone who is really anticipating that this money will come tomorrow or next week or the next year, it's not going to, because it's going to be right up until the early 2020s. And even then, the government hasn't announced exactly how it's going to be funding social care and all of the other things that the Prime Minister has said have been her priorities in the past. This is a textbook example of how, no matter what the government does, no matter what the Prime Minister says that she wants to do, she cannot escape the Brexit prism through which she always has to put and project every single issue.
Lewis, thank you.
It is the end of the sticking plaster approach to health funding promised Theresa May today. The £20 billion a year boost to spending will, she said, come mainly from taxes, although she repeated her claim that some part of the increase will be paid for by a Brexit dividend. That suggestion has been widely attacked as unrealistic, even by some Conservatives. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has been looking at whether the amount matches spending levels by previous governments.
Why not?
Happy 70th birthday, NHS, and a present from the Prime Minister, a bonanza to see the health service into the future. £20 billion extra by 2023-24. It comes with both an admission.
This has meant that despite more funding, more doctors and more nurses, and great progress on treatments, our NHS is under strain.
And strings attached.
So in return for this increase in funding, the government will agree with the NHS later this year a 10-year plan for its future. This must be a plan that ensures every penny is well spent. It must be a plan that tackles waste, reduces bureaucracy, and eliminates unacceptable variation, with all these efficiency savings reinvested back into patient care.
The battle scars weren't visible today, but the Chancellor, the Health and Social Care Secretary and the head of NHS England, along with the Prime Minister, went to the wire on Friday over this settlement. At one point it seemed as if it wouldn't happen. But having got there, then they found it was not as widely welcomed as they might have hoped. Experts had said at least 4% was needed if the NHS was to do more than just tread water. And is it really as generous as it first seems? Since the birth of the health service in 1948, funding for the NHS in England has gone up by an average 3.7%. Except most recently, during the age of austerity, funding increased by just 1.1%. That was between 2010 and 15. Today's promise is to increase the budget on average by 3.4% until 2023. And that means it doesn't reach that historic average.
Much of today's speech was about modernising the health service, the NHS of the future, while retaining that fundamental principle that it should remain free at the point of delivery. What hasn't been laid out in explicit terms is how the government is going to pay for it. There will be more asked from the public, and there will be, we're told, a Brexit dividend, though many have a doubt that there is that money there.
The £350 million Brexit promise. It's dogged the government since the referendum. Now they're saying, here it is. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, on the other hand, says, actually it isn't here because it doesn't add up. It will initially cost, they say, public finances about £15 billion a year to exit.
Every serious economist has completely blown apart the idea that it's coming from a Brexit dividend. It's a Brexit deceit. It's going to come from borrowing. The Tories are going to be putting up borrowing, and they're going to be putting up your tax, and you still won't even be seen within 18 weeks for treatment. That's what a mess it is.
The Prime Minister did today promise more spending on mental health and legislation, if needed, to overcome any barriers to improving the NHS. So what was missing?
One is capital, which you need to spend on infrastructure, which is what we need to modernise the system, and also biggest of all is social care, where that really seemed to be kicked into the long grass, certainly only even beginning to look at that next year. So I think those are missed opportunities, let alone public health. So I think a gesture in the right direction, but not enough to modernise, unfortunately.
And if there was any doubt about the need to improve the very buildings that house the health services, There was this story.
The last hospital that I visited had a porta cabin above its intensive treatment unit, and there was water running down the walls of the intensive treatment unit, and they had to evacuate that unit. That's because the Trust couldn't get the capital that it needed to replace that outdated building.
Congratulations, Secretary of State.
And well might Jeremy Hunt smile. It was said he threatened to resign if he did not get the settlement he'd wanted. But the other ministers are thought to be furious that health got in there first.
Are you pressuring the Treasury for more money, Minister?
And Mrs May and the Chancellor will now face many more demands for spending, especially from defence, schools and housing.
Victoria MacDonald reporting. So, what's been the reaction in Westminster to today's announcement? Let's go over to our political editor, Gary Gibbon. Gary, how did this go down with the Cabinet?
Exactly as Victoria suspected in that report. The Defence Secretary put down a marker that he wanted more money for his department. The Home Secretary talked about policing. There was, as Victoria predicted there, a bid for a bit more money on housing. I'm told it wasn't brittle, but it was definitely a move. And the Chancellor responded by saying, no, this is a one-off, this is especially for health. And he also said that the Brexit money is spent, so don't think you're going to get any of that. I'm not sure he actually thinks there's definitely going to be Brexit money, but that's another point. He said, if you want more spending, more revenues coming into the government, a more buoyant economy is what you need. And he was subtle but not over subtle about this. You need to buy into my kind of softer Brexit, was his message to the Cabinet. There was no pushback in the room on that, I'm told, but that could be partly explained by the fact that the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, wasn't there.
Well, so do we know how Chancellor Hammond thinks he is actually going to pay for it?
We don't know, because he doesn't know. I'm told that even in the budget to come this autumn, we won't get the full damage restored. We won't know exactly how it's all going to be paid for. There has been a strong signal in the past and again today that there's no interest in the government in doing a pure hypothecated tax where you come up with something, say, for instance, all fuel duty goes to the NHS, something like that, because of the worry that if fuel consumption goes down or whatever, you won't get the money into the NHS. But every other form of tax, I'm told by a government source, is on the agenda. And given there were some assurances given about certain bits of the tax mechanism in the Tory manifesto, that will strike some people as a fairly alarming thought. Philip Hammond was insisting today in Cabinet that his fiscal rules stay, and that, in case you'd forgotten, is balancing the books by the mid-2020s and debt falling by 2021. But interestingly, one Cabinet Minister said to me he looked like he was standing on sand, and went on to say those fiscal rules have been completely rewritten by this.
Will the public buy a Brexit dividend and or the need to rise taxes?
I think if you're a member of the public who was mad keen for Brexit, you might pat yourself on the back and say, that's my handiwork and I pulled that off. If you're the sort of member of the public who listens a lot to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, you might look with a bit of scepticism at the claim. I think, as implied by what I was saying before, Theresa May's audience here is a slightly closer public, her cabinet, her party in Parliament. And one of her aides has been going around talking to MPs today and saying this NHS wheeze helps us get buy-in from the Tory Brexiteers. I think one of the things you're meant to do if you're doing some sort of magic trick is not tell people how it works.
Gary Gibbon at Westminster. Well, when it comes to public opinion, do voters accept that there is a £20 billion Brexit dividend to spend on the NHS? And separately, will they accept the need for tax rises without punishing the government? Paul McNamara went to Romford in Essex, which voted predominantly to leave the EU, to find out.
Welcome to sunny Romford. In summer 2016, almost 70% of voters voted for Brexit. And in spring 2018, it was announced the local hospital trust was £481 million in debt. If there's anywhere that should welcome a so-called Brexit dividend, you'd think it might be Romford.
So do the people here think they're about to get what they voted for? Do they really believe that this proposed new money is actually part of the Brexit dividend, or is this simply the best bit of PR a potential tax rise has ever had?
As far as I'm concerned, that money's going to come out of taxes, nothing else. Where's the dividend?
Then that big bus with £350 million on the side of it, and said that money was going to come back to the NHS. Did you believe it?
No, of course not.
No, not in a million years. Not yet, anyway.
Well, if they can get more money from the NHS, that would be brilliant.
Where do you think that money's going to come from?
Us, the taxpayers.
OK, so we haven't been able to find that many people that actually believe this is part of a Brexit dividend. But more importantly, do they really care as long as the NHS is getting a bit more money? And are they happy to pay for it out of their own pockets? How do you feel then about a few extra billion going to the NHS?
No, it'd be good if it did happen.
Even if you've got to pay a bit more tax for it?
And social care. I work in social care and it's sadly got less money than ever.
I'm a pensioner now, but the thing is, I'll still pay taxes and I'm willing to pay more tax if it's going to help the NHS out.
So I rather pay the tax and NHS takes care of me, takes care of my children, takes care of my family, and everyone is happy.
So you don't care, more taxes, Brexit dividend, whatever it is, as long as more money is going to the NHS?
I don't know what Brexit dividend means, but so long more money is going to the NHS, yes, I'm happy with that.
Well, now, earlier I sat down with the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and I began by asking him whether this cash injection will really make a big difference.
Well, I think it's very important to be upfront that this is not going to mean an immediate end to pressures on the front line where people are working extremely hard. You've covered a lot in your programmes, and nor is it going to mean an immediate end to money worries in the NHS.
But for a 70th birthday and making a big song and dance about 70 years old, you'd have thought you could do better than offer less than what they've been getting on average for the last 70 years.
Well, I think it is significant that after 10 years of austerity, when we've had incredibly difficult decisions to make with national finances to get the economy back on its feet, that we are now moving to quite close to the long-run average as opposed to the much, much smaller rises. But what I would say is the debate we often have is how much do we spend compared to other Western European countries? And we spend at the moment about the Western European average as a proportion of our GDP. By the end of this 5-year period, we will be spending nearly as much as France currently spends. So France and Germany are the two of the biggest spenders, and we are making a very big statement.
But it's completely unfunded, and this is exactly what you accuse the Labour Party of doing. We hear it all the time.
Well, it's not unfunded at all, John.
Well, you haven't told us how it's going to be funded.
We made an announcement that we are prepared to commit to a £20 billion a year increase.
Maybe you haven't told us
budget.
where it's going to come from.
If you'll let me, I'll be very happy to answer those questions. But the precise details of how it will be funded will be outlined in the budget. But we have made clear that the broad way that we intend to fund it is threefold. Firstly, because we won't be paying subscriptions to the EU, and the British people voted very clearly in that referendum. Whichever side of the debate you were on, they voted that they wanted their money to be spent on key public services like the NHS and not on subscriptions to EU membership. Secondly, economic growth. And thirdly, and Theresa May was very clear about this, if you're making an increase in funding of this scale, saying that we're going to move to French levels of GDP, that is also a commitment for the tax system to bear.
But all three of those things are completely sort of vague. I mean, we're talking about a situation in which growth is falling. Even the British Chambers of Commerce today have had to cut next year's prediction for growth. And your own OBR, your own agency, has said to you, there is no Brexit dividend. So it can't be coming from that. It can't be coming from growth. Where is it going to come from? Tax, tax, tax?
Well, we have said that there will be an implication for tax, but let me just say this.
A tax on poorer people too.
I want to answer your question. You said, why aren't we spelling it out in detail? And I'll tell you why. These things are always spelt out in detail at budgets. Now, this agreement yesterday that was announced was agreed with the Chancellor and the Treasury. And the reason that the negotiations were difficult was because, quite rightly, Philip Hammond, who very much wants to put more money into the NHS, but he quite rightly said it must be a promise that we can honour. And we wanted to give the NHS an indication. This is actually what the NHS asked us. They said, well, tell us how much money you can put on the table. And I was saying this should be for the long term, so for the first time it's a 5-year settlement. The NHS has never had that, and there's going to be a 10-year plan behind that. They will then have 6 months to put together that plan, and then when that plan is finalised, providing it meets our key objectives, then we will have the budget and the plan. It will all be approved, and we will say precisely how we're going to raise that extra funding.
Can you guarantee that when it comes to it, it will not be the poor who've been so badly hit by austerity who will end up footing this bill?
Well, I'm not going to predict the exact contents of the budget. What I know for sure is that the Treasury has made a commitment that it knows it can honour. Because
well, why has it got this Brexit element in it when we're talking about the short term? Not your longer term plans, but the short term. Here's Sarah Wollaston, Dr. Sarah Wollaston, MP. The Brexit dividend tosh was expected, but treats the public as fools. She said that in response to what Mrs May said yesterday.
Well, if we had been talking about funding the NHS in the next 2 years from not paying those subscriptions, then that would have been a reasonable thing to say, but we're not saying that. We are saying that over the next 5 years, yes, there will be less subscriptions to pay to Brussels, and towards the end of that period, that is something that can help the NHS. But we are also saying...
why were you not prepared to stand in front of that bus with Boris Johnson and say, folks, my department, me, 350 million, all the rest of it, if you believed it, if you believe it now, did you believe it then?
I was on a different side in the Brexit debate, as you well know, John.
That's no excuse. It's either true or false. It's your department.
Yeah, so I think you'll find plenty of comments from me saying why that gross figure is not something that you can depend on. But that is not what we're saying either.
Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
It just shows the size of the funding challenge facing the NHS. Theresa May had hardly finished confirming a £20 billion rise in spending for the health service when the head of the NHS Confederation warned of tough years ahead. The Prime Minister declined to reveal how the extra funds will be found, and tonight a Sky data poll suggests the majority of the public think the government is being dishonest over where the money will come from. More on that in a moment. But first, our health correspondent, Paul Kelso, reports.
Hello. A welcome on the wards for Theresa May. Hello. Nice to meet you. After yet another winter crisis brought the National Health Service to breaking point, the Prime Minister believes she knows how to fix it.
Yes, yes. Oh, wow. Go on, Dad, why not?
Why not? Putting her name to an eye-catching new long-term funding deal.
We cannot continue to put a sticking plaster on the NHS budget each year. So we will do more than simply give the NHS a one-off injection of cash. Under our plan, NHS funding will grow on average by 3.4% in real terms each year. By 2023-24, the NHS England budget will increase by £20.5 billion in real terms compared with today. That means it will be £394 million a week higher in real terms.
How to pay for it is a question the Chancellor will answer in the autumn, with tax rises as certain as the Prime Minister's promise of a Brexit dividend is questionable, and no guarantee either on when patients will benefit.
The NHS has record waiting lists. This winter was the worst ever performance in A&E, and there's a staffing crisis. When can patients expect to see an improvement?
We want to see improvements in exactly the sort of performance areas that you have spoken about, like A&E. We recognise significant pressure that A&E was under across the board in the NHS this winter. But we also want to see, looking long term, actually improvements in other areas.
This offer from the Prime Minister comes after 8 years in which governments of which she was a part have imposed the tightest ever funding squeeze on the NHS and seen it repeatedly miss targets. While welcome, there are plenty who believe this money, however it's paid for, will barely touch the sides.
The Prime Minister is promising a 3.4% funding increase for 5 years from 2019, worth £394 million a week. That's just above the amount required for the NHS to stand still, and short of the 4% experts and economists say is required for improvement. It will lift spending as a share of GDP from 9.7% to around 11%, similar to the current level in France and Germany.
You okay there?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
In return, the government wants to see improvements in care for patients like David, being treated for prostate cancer on a state-of-the-art halcyon radiotherapy machine in Romford.
The way I've been treated has been fantastic. It's not cheap, and these new machines are going to be wonderful for the cancer treatment. So, I know there is talk about the prospect of them more money coming into the NHS, and I think that would be a great thing.
The Prime Minister also wants improvements in A&E waiting times and mental health treatment, a a challenge even with money, says this chief executive.
We don't yet know about any additional money for social care. We don't yet know about how the money will play into capital monies to rebuild hospitals. And for example, here at Queen's, we need to expand our A&E department. We don't yet know where that capital money is going to come from.
This was a striking affirmation of the NHS from the Prime Minister, better funded and free at the point of use. But we will still have to pay for it. Paul Kelso, Sky News.
So the Prime Minister has conceded that taxpayers will have to pay for the NHS spending increase, but says that economic growth and a Brexit dividend will also help cover the costs. But tonight, a Sky Data poll suggests a majority of the public believes the government isn't being straight over where the money will be found. Well, the majority of those questioned, 52%, thought the government was being dishonest about NHS funding, and only 31% thought they were being honest. When asked if they would be prepared to pay more taxes for the NHS, 54% said yes and 38% said no. And only 34% of those surveyed thought that there'd be a Brexit dividend. That's the money that will no longer go to the EU after the UK leaves, while 47% thought that there wouldn't be. Sky's economics editor, Ed Conway, reports.
It's time to revisit an old friend. We are somewhere in the English countryside on the trail of the biggest beast of them all, the Vote Leave bus.
It's 2 years since we chased this bus around the country, but the promise on its side still lives on. Now the government says it's about to start spending the Brexit dividend on the NHS. But do its sums actually add up?
The short answer is no. That dividend was supposed to be all about how we'll no longer have to pay into the EU budget once we leave, but we're still paying in for the next 4 or 5 years. And even if we didn't, we wouldn't necessarily be able to spend all that money on the NHS. Here's why. Consider what happened last year. We paid £18.6 billion, just over £350 million a week, by the way, into the EU. We got back £5.6 billion in a rebate and £4.1 billion in the money the EU spends here on farmers' special projects and so on. And that leaves £8.9 billion. So if we weren't paying that to Brussels, could we go out and spend it? Not quite, because at the same time, the government's also making about £9.9 billion less in tax revenues because the economy is that bit weaker post-referendum. Subtract that, and there's no dividend, but a Brexit deficit of £1 billion.
How will that go down, given that at the time, that's what voters felt they were being promised?
If this money, if money doesn't go into this NHS, I will go mad.
So the Prime Minister would be wise to tread carefully here.
Without a Brexit dividend, we'll have to find another way of getting that £4 billion or so for the NHS. So you could raise the basic rate of income tax by a penny, and that would get you some of the way. You could raise the higher rate by 3p or cut everyone's tax-free personal allowance by a whopping £600. Alternatively, the Chancellor could cancel the planned cuts in corporation tax and fiddle around with national insurance.
Anyway, there's a bigger question here, which is whether this extra NHS spending is enough.
£20.5 billion, even for the NHS, is a significant sum of money. The problem is not that it's a lot of money, it's that the pressures on our health service grow by even more than this. And as Theresa May set out today, our ambition for the NHS is not for it to stand still, but to improve in key areas.
Part of the problem is a rising population and many years of small funding increases.
When you take a look back over the sweep of history, you get a sense of just what that means. These bars show you how fast per capita health spending has increased each year since 1955. The new plans over here, the red bars, you can see they would involve the biggest increases since 2010, but they'd still be well below the post-war average.
All the same, there's widespread relief that the NHS is finally getting a meaningful spending increase, even if no one knows where the money's coming from. Ed Conway, Sky News.
And Sky's senior political correspondent Beth Rigby is in Downing Street for us tonight. So, Beth, how much is this a £20 billion gamble?
Well, Anna, it is quite a gamble for the Prime Minister. She is going deep
into Labour territory today with this NHS pledge. If you think about how the two parties have lined up in recent elections, Labour has always been the party of the NHS. The Tories have been the party of economic competence. David Cameron, you'll remember, in the run-up to the 2015 general election said, I can't win on the NHS, but I can neutralise it at the ballot box and take it away as a threat to me. Theresa May wants to do more than that. She wants to win on the NHS. She wants it to be, to quote her, her #1 spending priority. She wants to end her term in office as the Prime Minister who has delivered on the NHS. Well, why is she doing that? Well, put it simply, she has no choice. You saw Ed chasing the Brexit bus up the motorway back in the EU referendum. That bus was led by people in her cabinet, and part of the pact of the Vote Leave group of people and voters was that in return for leaving the EU, they would get more money into the NHS. Whether she likes it or not, she now has to deliver on that promise, and so she is now setting herself up as the deliverer of funding for the NHS. The big question is, the NHS bosses say they need more money than she's offering. So when it comes to polling day, will the public believe her when she says that she's delivered on the promise she made today?
Beth, thank you.
Much trailed, much hyped. The Prime Minister confirmed today higher spending on the NHS, $20 billion a year. And yet she couldn't say precisely where the money was going to come from. All she would say was taxpayers would have to contribute a bit more to add to the supposed savings from the payments not going to Brussels after Brexit. It'll be up to the Chancellor to decide how to make it all work in the budget later in the year. Labour criticised the amount for neither being budgeted for nor being enough to save the NHS after 8 years of austerity.
The Prime Minister this morning, here making small talk with patients.
You've got nail varnish that
matches
the Yes, this is very, very impressive.
But at this hospital with the biggest of announcements. Today she signed off on the largest increase in health funding for years. The government can't yet say how it will be paid for, but today the Prime Minister made clear a lot of it will come from you.
As a country, we will need to contribute a bit more. Taxpayers will need to contribute a bit more, but we will do that in a fair and balanced way. And we want to listen to people about how we do that. And the Chancellor will bring forward the full set of proposals before the spending review.
That review comes next year, but today Labour called for more details sooner.
I think they've got to be upfront now with the British people and tell the British people which tax rises are going up. How are they going to fund this plan? I don't think it's fair on the British people, given the financial squeeze we've all been under.
If the Prime Minister is going to find the £20 billion from somewhere else, where could it come from? The government could freeze the increase in the personal allowance on which we don't pay any tax. According to the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, that could raise £3.5 billion. They could increase income tax and national insurance rates by 1%. That could raise £8.5 billion. And then there's borrowing. The IFS says the Chancellor could increase it within his fiscal rules, but it would mean missing his target to eliminate the deficit by 2025. However the government finds the money, it still may not be enough. This chief executive of Nottingham's hospital believes some services may still need to be cut in future.
The fact that it's a 5-year investment plan and it's part of a wider NHS 10-year plan is a significant step forward. I think, though, that there is still challenges across health and social care, and there will still be tough decisions that need to be made as we go forward.
Today's new funding is a victory for the Health Secretary, but it won't be visible immediately.
Here on ITV News, we covered the winter health crisis. You told us it was the worst crisis you had ever experienced. You're now the longest-serving health secretary. Will this winter now be much better?
Well, I think it's really important to say that although this is a very significant announcement for the NHS, this is not going to mean an immediate end to all the pressures on the front line. Well, I think we can give hope to some of those people that you filmed over the winter, that, you know, we will be able to make them that commitment which I think I wanted to make, which is that it's not going to be like this every winter, and we've got to find a better way of doing things going forward.
Finding that better way of running the NHS is one challenge, but now the big question of the next 6 months will be how on earth they fund it. Allegra Stratton, News at 10.
And our political editor, Robert Peston, joins me now. So let's pick up where Allegra left off there. How on earth will they fund it? She's kicked it down the road a little bit again, hasn't she?
She has. The Tory party is a bit boxed in because in their last election manifesto, they said they wanted to reduce taxes for people and for businesses, and they made actually a couple of specific promises on reducing corporation tax and increasing the amount that we all pay before we pay the basic and top rates of taxes. So she has got limited room for manoeuvre. Now, I think about half of the 20 billion that's needed will come from additional borrowing on the government's own forecast. It could borrow another 10 billion or so and meet its rules, but it then has still got to find a whopping £10 billion from tax. Now, for me, the slightly odd thing is that actually opinion polls show that people want more money going into the NHS, and therefore the least painful time to raise taxes would be when you make the NHS announcement. Now, slightly fear by the time the budget comes around in November, all people will see is probably, and I think it will come from an income tax rise, maybe an increase in the basic rate, and after 2020, freezing those allowances. So here's an interesting thing. She hasn't announced those tax rises today, which would be the rational thing for any party to do, unless, and this is what the Labour Party thinks, and Brenda in Bristol's not going to like this, unless she's preparing for a possible election in the autumn.
OK, well, let's just park that one there and throw in the word Brexit, because all roads lead to and from Brexit at the moment, and it was a component in the decision-making behind this.
Yeah, and a Brexit disaster is one reason why people think she might have to go to the country in the autumn. Now, the latest instalment in a saga of mini disasters came today when the House of Lords voted for an amendment which would give MPs more power to block a no-deal Brexit. She did not want them to do that. That comes back to the House of Commons on Wednesday. I've been talking to the rebels in the Tory party about whether they will back that amendment, which then would become law, because the Labour Party would also back it, and they're making up their minds because they know how unbelievably embarrassing it would be for the Prime Minister to lose this vote. On the other hand, to use that phrase, they want to take back control over the final Brexit decision.
OK, Robert, for the time being, thank you very much indeed for that.
Arguably, it's the biggest thing since Brexit, the Prime Minister's announcement that taxes will go up to finance extra spending on the NHS. This from a party that has for decades bet on the public being tax-phobic. Well, at the moment, the details of the new policy are sketchy. We don't know which taxes will rise, and the announcement has been wrapped up in a misleading claim that we can spend a Brexit dividend when the government is currently working on figures that suggest there isn't one. But put aside these fine points, this is a huge moment, a Conservative government raising taxes, not to cut the deficit, but to increase the size of the state. And this could be just a start. We're told that social care is going to be dealt with too, and at some point there's also pressure for more spending on defence, prisons, local government, you name it. No one is going to say this is easy. Can the Treasury get this past Tory backbenchers? But a lot is at stake. Our political editor Nick Watt is with me. Nick, tax and spend Tories. We heard more about the spending increases than the tax increases to come. But do you think it's a big moment?
Yes, I mean, I think it is a big moment. I can remember 2009 when George Osborne ushered in the era of austerity from opposition, saying we're now going to have to fight on terrain where we have lost before, and 9 years later it feels very different. Now, this announcement from Theresa May that people are going to have to do their bit, which, as you're saying, sounds like there will be tax rises. That does raise questions about the Conservatives' manifesto for the last general election, where they said it is our firm intention to reduce taxes on Britain's businesses and working families, talking about cutting corporation tax, talking about the ongoing rises in the personal tax allowance, big question marks over those commitments. Now, Jeremy Hunt's camp are absolutely delighted with this, but they are saying, look, you're really going to have to be clear that this will probably have to mean tax rises. And one person said to me in that camp, you know, it really is a cul-de-sac for the Conservatives to keep going into general elections with those clear commitments on cutting taxes. So, look, I've been looking at how Theresa May, who was really spooked by last year's general election, how she's been trying to change perceptions of the Tory party on the NHS. It's a puzzle the Conservatives have never quite mastered, how to prove they really cherish the NHS. And so today, Theresa May tried to convince the public that the Tories' professions of love for our public health service are genuine, with a dramatic increase in funding.
We cannot continue to put a sticking plaster on the NHS budget each year. So we will do more than simply give the NHS a one-off injection of cash. Under our plan, NHS funding will grow on average by 3.4% in real terms each year from 2019-20 to 2023-24. We will also provide an additional £1.25 billion each year to cover a specific pensions pressure.
So a warm reception for Theresa May as she signalled an end of austerity in health spending. This is her response to last year's general election, when she was given the fright of her life as voters indicated that they had tired of the spending squeeze. The conundrum for Theresa May is to neutralise two distinct political challenges. Downing Street hopes to overcome the perception that the Tories have never felt at ease with a wholly publicly funded health system. And then, the Prime Minister hopes to reassure nervous Leave supporters by declaring that some of the extra funding will be paid by the highly disputed Brexit dividend, money earmarked for Brussels that will remain here. A prominent Leave supporter who in the past has questioned NHS funding is happy.
I'm a strong believer in fiscal discipline. We still have a deficit of 2% of GDP, even though the economy's been growing since 2010. But I cannot see Philip Hammond opening up the coffers at all. I think he'll still remain a disciplinarian in this respect. And I do think a lot of people see the NHS as a special case.
There are several MPs that I know and see every day who were cured, whose lives were saved by the NHS, and I'm one of them. It is just the case that Conservatives love the NHS, depend on the NHS, care about the NHS, think of it as a priority as much as any other member of society.
But even Nick Bowles warns there are limits to the easing of austerity.
There will be others who will argue that we should be spending more on defence. There will be others who will be arguing that we should be spending more on the police. We obviously can't do all of those things and stick to what I think is the key fiscal rule, which is bringing the debt level down as a percentage of GDP. But what I think we can do is show more flexibility than perhaps we have done in the past. And I think today's announcement is a very important first step, but it's not probably the last step.
Labour is unimpressed.
If this is all about the Tories trying to recover ground from Labour following the 2017 election, I think that is a bit of a lost cause as well. It's an attempt, it's a forlorn late attempt to try and recover ground which they've thrown away for the last 8 years, and the reality is people will not believe them. You suddenly decide after 8 years of austerity you're easing up on it. What case have they made heretofore for the easing up on it? They've made nothing. They're spooked.
Theresa May hopes to solve her party's image problem over the NHS in a way that will deliver a new lease of life for her troubled government. But this puzzle will be far from easy, with questions over who will foot the bill and whether austerity will be eased in other areas.
Nick, what there? So how far does this particular announcement today stretch to solving the funding issues for the NHS? Our policy editor Chris Cook spent the day crunching some numbers. He's here with me. So Chris, first of all, was it inevitable that it would be health that would be the thing that would prompt a kind of, or trigger a kind of rethink about taxes and whether they need to go up?
Health would definitely be the leading candidate for this. And to understand why, it might be worth looking at a graph we've got here showing spending on health by the state going back to 1949. You can see basically from the 1950s through to now, there are dips and troughs, but you know, it's pretty much one-way traffic. The demand for healthcare, the amount we're willing to spend on it just keeps rising. There are three big reasons really. The first is health is what economists call a primary good. So as we've got richer as a country, which is what happened over those years, we're willing to put more and more of our disposable, of our income into, as a country, into healthcare, and we demanded ever higher standards. The second thing is we've got older, and the third thing is that technology has improved, so there's more stuff that we can now treat. If you look at the very right-hand side of the graph, you can see it's flat. That's basically the period since 2010, when we sort of frozen the amount of money we're putting into healthcare as a share of national income. The thing is, the demand for new technologies hasn't stopped. The number of people turning up at hospitals has got higher and higher and higher, and what we expect of healthcare has got bigger and bigger. Jeremy Hunt's been talking about the 7-day NHS and all that stuff. We've not dropped our expectations.
Right. So this is rising proportion of a rising income. The changes, the increase they've just announced, it sounds like quite big money. If you're inside the NHS looking at it, is it going to feel like big money?
Well, it's going to feel like a relief. If we pull up the next graph, what you'll see is that while it feels like a relief, it is probably not as much as you're hoping for. So that's the real settlement, 3% per year over the next few years. Theresa May said 3.4%, slightly tricky money issues going on around that. In truth, the IFS and the Health Foundation have done research which suggested you needed about 3.3% for us to be at standstill, for us to not have further deterioration over the coming years. And you need about 4% to really fix things and sort things out, to modernise the NHS. That sounds like a lot of money, but it might be worth just bringing up our historical growth rates. So you can see it left, the 3% there, what Theresa May's pledging. It's more than the coalition, which was only 1 and a bit percent, more than Theresa May and David Cameron after 2015, but less than Thatcher and Major, less than the pre-1979 government, and about half of what the Blair and Brown governments put in every year.
Chris, thank you very
much. In growth terms.
In the growth terms, yeah, the money's more. Well, it's what we've seen from the Prime Minister today, the first sense of a broader new look for the Conservative Party. Ruth Davidson's the leader of the party in Scotland. She joins us now from Edinburgh. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Hi, Evan.
Good to talk to you. You support this, don't you? Because you, I think, in a speech in May, were basically saying this is what the party needs to do, right?
Well, what had happened, it had become apparent that there was a discussion that was going on at a senior level within the Conservative Party. I was doing a big speech in the University of Glasgow, and I wanted to lay out where I was on this and where the Scottish Party was on this. And, you know, I'm like Nick Bowles, I'm one of these people that's had their life saved by the NHS. They not only saved my life when I was 5 and I got run over by a truck, they saved my legs. I spent a lot of my childhood in and out of hospital, and then 20 years later, because I'm pretty clumsy, I broke my back in several places and they put me back together again a second time. So, you know, I'm one of these people that has relied on it throughout my entire life as well. And I do think that there is a special case when it comes to health funding. I think it's an article of faith in this country. I think it's damn near a national religion in this country.
But do you agree with Nick Bowles in that piece who said this is a first step and the party should have more flexibility? Obviously can't do everything, but you'd expect this to go a bit further. At least on social care, you'd expect a bit more, right?
Well, we've got a different way of funding social care in Scotland that's devolved, so I don't really want to stray into that territory if that's all right. But what I would say is, we've always said that we needed, after the crash, we came in 2010, as a government, we needed to get the borrowing, the debt under control. When we did that, then we would be able to look at these spending priorities. We're now bringing down debt as a proportion of GDP. We've got these fiscal rules in place, we're sticking to it, and now is the time to look at our spending priorities. And the Prime Minister today could not have been clearer that the NHS is her #1 spending priority. That's why there's this cash injection.
Okay. You're a very plain-speaking politician. Would you say...
So they say.
Would you say austerity, when you look back over the last 8 years, that austerity, the goal of getting the budget deficit down, did that put too much weight on spending cuts and not quite enough weight on the tax side of the burden?
Well, I think we had to balance it. We also had to make sure that we didn't shrink our economy, and that's why corporation tax came down. That's why the personal allowance, so income tax, what you could earn before you started paying it, went up. And the reason that this is important, and I think sometimes we lose this part, is that if we didn't do that, we would be charging our children for what we're paying for now, and that's not fair.
You could have done more of it through raising taxes rather than cutting spending. What it looks like has happened is you cut spending a bit too far, so now you're saying, oh, we need to put taxes up, and you don't accept that. Okay.
No, I don't accept that. I'll tell you why I don't accept that, because you've also got to look at growth rate. So in the last 8 years, from 2010, the naysayers that came out, the Danny Blanchflowers of this world that said we're going to have 4 million unemployed, people that said that we would have the lowest growth rates during this time, they were all proved wrong. Why? Because we needed to be able to show the country that we were open for business. We needed to show companies to come and invest here. We've managed to grow employment in that time. It's now the highest for nearly 40 years. And the thing is, if you don't do that, if you don't have a healthy economy, you have less money for public services. So it is about a balance, but there was always going to come a time where the hard yards have been done. And I pay absolute tribute to the people of the United Kingdom for tightening their belts, because that's what saw us through those hard yards. And now is the time to look at those spending priorities.
Just a quick one. I'm talking about the future of your party, and and this is quite a big change of direction. Often they say you're the future of the Conservative Party. People say. 3 weeks ago, the papers were full of stories about you and Michael Gove. You had a pact. Gove was going to be PM, and then you'd do it afterwards. The new icon, Tina Turner, some of the papers said. How's that pact with Michael Gove going? Because not all his pacts have ended terribly well.
Well, there wasn't a pact, and I did like a fantastic piece that was written in the Times that was saying that the reason that I was helping to launch this think tank, because I was asked to speak at it, Michael Gove was asked to speak, was because I was putting together a run for my next big job, which would be Prime Minister, which is nonsense. The big job that I was about to announce was that I'm about to become a mother. So that shows you what you can take as a pinch of salt when it comes to the UK press. But I've got one thing to say on the health issue, if I may, Evan, before we move on, is that we've seen already a 10.9% increase in health spending over the last 8 years in England. We've seen less than half that in Scotland. The SNP have not passed on health consequentials. We in Scotland, the Tory party in Scotland, are demanding that the £2 billion that's going to come to Scotland as part of this injection we've seen down south announced by the Prime Minister must be spent on health.
I mean, they'll say you'll always support a tax increase for the UK, but you'll never vote for a tax increase in Scotland. But let's not get into that.
Well, we've got growth rates that are less than half of the rest of the UK, and putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage doesn't increase those growth rates. And again, that leaves you with less money for public services.
Quick one on Brexit. I'm not going to ask you about whether there's a Brexit dividend, because we know, as a matter of fact, the government doesn't believe there's one. So there's no point in arguing about that. I want to ask you about the meaningful vote, because it's a big issue, whether the Commons should support the Lords and give MPs, when the Brexit deal comes to fruition, what's called a meaningful vote on it. Dominic Grieve, are you on his side in all of this? It's a huge issue in the Commons at the moment. The Dominic Grieve side or the government side?
Well, the Prime Minister has said there will be a vote in the House of Commons. I agree with that. When it comes to all the questions that are flying around about another vote for the public, another vote in all of these different places, my issue with referenda, and I've fought two now, not one like the rest of the UK,
I didn't
is
ask
that
you about the
you don't get to rerun it just because you don't like the answer.
I asked you about
I was on the wrong side. I was on the wrong side of this. I agree with it. I lost.
I'm asking about Dominic Grieve's amendment. Would you vote for his amendment, or would you vote for the government one?
I have every respect for Dominic Grieve, but I would not vote for his amendment.
Ruth Davidson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.